All right. Welcome back from lunch, everyone. We're going to get started here with our first panel of the afternoon, Artificial Intelligence, Artificial Information, a critical overview of Chat GPT. And I'm going to pass off the honors to the moderator here, Dr. Lease, a professor at UT Austin School of Information and an Amazon scholar who's also a faculty founder and leader of UT Austin's Good Systems. Dr. Lease, take it away.
Great, thank you very much. And are the slides up? Oh, there we go, great. Okay, wonderful. So welcome, everyone. This is going to be a really fun panel. You've got some of the brightest minds of UT here, and I've had a great chance to hear a little bit of the content you'll hear from our panelists today, and I learned a few things myself. So we have 3 talented student presenters. I'll be moderating the panel. I'll start by just saying a few words briefly about why I'm here and myself, and then I'll turn it over to each of the students to introduce themselves when they present. And we'll have presentations in my order, Macy, Alec, and then Enrique. So I direct the Artificial Intelligence and Human-Centered Computing Lab here at UT Austin. As you could imagine, all anyone wants to talk about right now is GPT and these related technologies, and certainly that's what all of my media inquiries have been about lately. So that's certainly something we're all hearing about, and as a computer scientist, it's one of the fun things I've had a chance to learn a little bit about and work in myself. Great. The second reason I'm here, as mentioned, is I'm one of the faculty founders and leaders of Good Systems. So while we all know that AI is being more powerful and pervasive in our world, there are increasing concerns about whether the systems are acting responsibly and ethically. And so at UT, we have a grand challenge called Good Systems, thinking about how is it that we can ensure the design of AI technologies are most beneficial to society. Just to give you a sense of the footprint, this is an 8-year, $10 million project. This was announced by our university president, Fenves, several years ago, talking about the importance of this. And again, we have about 150 researchers across the campus, spread over lots of different units. And one of the things that we think is if you want to design responsible, ethical AI technologies, you can't just leave it to the technologists. It really has to be an interdisciplinary effort. And we're going to hear today from panelists, also again, across a diverse range of expertise. The third reason I'm here is within Good Systems, we have 6 main projects that are running. I'm directing one of them around disinformation. So thinking about the role of AI in creating or curbing disinformation. So the main questions we're considering in this project are how can we design AI, responsible AI technologies to curb the spread of disinformation, misinformation, but also how is it that we can use a real societal challenge like disinformation as a test bed for developing general responsible AI technologies in general. So the last thing I'll say is we ran our first disinformation day this past fall. All of our recordings are online where we're thinking about this from the perspective of AI and related technologies and how they intersect with disinformation. And we hope you'll join us at a future one of those events. So with that, I'd like to turn it over and begin our wonderful presentations. So Macy?
Great. I'll take this over to the podium. Okay, so hello. My name is Macy Huang, and I'm a junior computer science major at UT Austin. So I'm just going to go talk a little bit about what GPT is and hopefully bring everyone up to speed on what it is, why it is, and how it's disrupting everything now and in the future. So yeah, I've decided to frame it as kind of an iceberg analogy, where the top of the iceberg is everything people know and can see, and then as we traverse down the iceberg, things get a little bit murkier. So if ChatGPT is an iceberg, we're all kind of the Titanic in that we've just hit the iceberg, and now we have to figure out what we're just going to do about it. So saving some people and leaving others to face consequences is definitely an approach. It's one of the approaches ever. But as leaders and policymakers, we have a responsibility to understand the new technology and mitigate the harmful effects while also promoting equal access to it. So these are the 6 levels at which I'll be discussing ChatGPT. So that's hopefully going to take you from understanding what GPT is to hopefully helping you to see the bigger picture as to what the future of AI is, at least right now. So just level 1, what is ChatGPT? So ChatGPT is an artificial intelligence chatbot created by a company called OpenAI, and it is a variant of their GPT 3.3 model. So you're able to interact with it in a naturalistic kind of a conversational way, and it processes your queries and generates text based on like a bunch of training data that it has, just taken from all across the internet. So this sometimes does lead into a little bit of trouble in that it's kind of a glorified next word predictor. So if I said to all of you, roses are red, violets are blank, like the obvious answer would be blue because that's just something that you heard before. But because the model can sometimes have these things called hallucinations, it might just make something up randomly. Like it might say violets are green, and that's just not correct based on the training data that it had, but we don't even know where these like hallucinations are coming from. So GPT-4, the model that OpenAI recently released, does curb some of this disinformation a little bit, but you have to be sure that when you're like generating responses from ChatGPT that you're fact-checking all of these things, especially given that in the GPT 3.5 model, we were seeing hallucinations at a rate of around 15 to 20%, which is extremely high and a little bit crazy. So next, how does it work? So GPT stands for Generative Pre-trained Transformer. And so transformers are a really powerful type of neural net. They're able to work with really long sequences of data, and that makes them great for tasks like natural language processing because you have to remember things pretty far back, like in the sequence of data that is passed in. So as thrilling as this is, we've seen in like past chatbots that because they're trained on human text and humans are often pretty problematic, they can become corrupted and espouse things like hate speech, nihilistic languages, like really anything like the worst of humanity. So OpenAI does have some safeguards in place to avoid having ChatGPT say anything that's like too controversial, but there are ways to get around that just because people just really throw anything at ChatGPT. So in the current AI landscape, it's mostly like the big tech companies that are able to invest the financial and computational resources, as well as having all of like the brains behind all of this gathered in one place to be able to create these big AI. So the next level, will it take my job? So as a CS major, my dad sent me a text a few weeks ago trying to convince me to switch to engineering, because he was like, I'm not sure if there's much of a future there for you anymore. And I'm guessing he probably learned that ChatGPT is capable of generating code. And it's actually pretty good code. So it's not at the level that it can replace a really good developer, but just like how freelancers might find themselves replaced by DALL-E or Midjourney artwork, simple entry-level jobs might start to disappear. So GitHub, which is owned by Microsoft, is integrating GPT-4 in its paid Copilot program. This allows the chatbot to explain code to you and fix simple bugs and like little security vulnerabilities. And we might see similar assistive technologies in just all over the industry. Every industry you can think of, from healthcare, law, finance, like there's really no end to like the things that it can be integrated with. And as I said before, it's really maybe not a good thing considering that the hallucination rate is so high. So that brings us to level 4, exploitation and ethics. So AI-generated content is kind of like analogous to outsourcing work in that it allows companies to provide services at like a much reduced cost, but at the cost of maybe lower quality and poorer quality control. And there's also the issue of interpretability. There's just so much we don't know about how neural networks are producing these like great answers. And so we're just kind of sticking our hands inside the ChatGPT black box and just trusting what comes out of it. So its responses can also be heavily affected by biases in data. And actually related to this, OpenAI hired Kenyan workers for less than $2 per hour to go through just a bunch of data and label the toxic data. So these were things containing like graphic descriptions of like hate and violence. They were really too much for any human to just go through and be able to like read and like come out psychologically okay. So that was all for the purposes of training its own content guideline enforcing network, which it is used today to like prevent some of these like flagrant like if you ask ChatGPT to generate a description of gore, it'll just plain out refuse because it knows that this thing is bad. But it's at the cost of these workers who were exploited. So also, there's kind of a privacy concern here in that ChatGPT was trained on data from all over the internet. So that includes things that maybe like you posted a website 15 years ago and like it just took that information without asking you for permission or even like compensating you for it. And then also by interacting with ChatGPT, you're giving it so much information about yourself, what you're looking for, like who you are, just this basic information about you. So that's all a lot to take in, and we haven't even gotten into the geopolitical ramifications of big AI, which I guess would be the fun part for all of you. So a couple of weeks ago, an open letter was published, and it called for a pause on developing these large language models. And I do disagree with a few of the points that were made in the letter, but it's correct that we don't really know what we're working with. We don't even know what we don't know about how we understand these things, and we don't know the full scope of the effects of ChatGPT. And since ChatGPT was launched, other countries are heavily investing in research for their own large language models. And it's becoming kind of a not nuclear, but AI arms race. And the US houses the companies that are leading it. A 6-month pause, though, as suggested in the open letter, does threaten to allow other countries, like China, to work towards catching up to our enormous lead. So in October, President Biden did place regulations to block China's semiconductor industry from developing using Western technologies. So that would help to prevent them from gaining access to the technology that will help them to develop more advanced AI. So that is one thing. There are also issues of disinformation, which I believe Alec will be getting into in his presentation. So where does that leave us? So ChatGPT has the power to be increasingly and importantly impactful on our productivity just over the entire economy. And it allows the power of AI to be placed in the hands of people who historically may not have had access to these things. Since before, working with AI was kept behind things like advanced degrees and training that most people were not able to get to. So this is enhanced kind of by OpenAI allowing access to their API, which allows other software to be integrated with the model. And we'll see this more and more as companies start developing their own integrations with ChatGPT. So despite all it knows, ChatGPT is still a specialized model, so it's geared toward conversational text generation, but it's still a major step toward developing an AGI, which is an artificial general intelligence, which is able to do just anything that a human can do and more. So the future is kind of exciting, a little bit terrifying at the same time. But figuratively, as global warming starts to melt away at our AI iceberg, we'll see all kinds of unintended but somewhat foreseeable effects that need to be addressed, hopefully by some of you. Thank you for your time.
All right, okay, cool. Thank you for that, Macy. Hi all, my name's Alec Leeper, and I'm a senior government major here at UT, and I'm starting at University of Texas Law School next semester. So that's a little bit about me, and I'm here to talk to you all about, there's Macy's sources. There's another slide. There we go, language models and misinformation. So as we dive into the topic about how ChatGPT and other GPT-powered bots interact with the information that it provides with us, it's important to start with an understanding of Chat GPT versus GPT. This will be particularly important for what I'm going to present to you today because I'm going to explore another bot that is GPT powered, but isn't necessarily done through Chat GPT. So GPT is the engine, the algorithm, the code that makes all of this work. It's the language model itself. Chat GPT is what you see when you go to OpenAI's website and you boot up that text box that you can type into, and it's the text that replies to you. So ChatGPT is the interface, GPT is the engine. So there are essentially two types of misinformation that are strictly relevant to what language models are able to propagate. There's benign misinformation, which is simply just a case of getting a fact wrong. It might tell you that 2 + 2 = 5. And you might look like an idiot if you believe it or if you can say that in front of someone else, but ultimately it's not going to cause material harm tangibly in the real world in the way that harmful misinformation could. So an example of benign misinformation from ChatGPT, I have here from Nate Silver. If you don't know who he is, he's from 538. He does statistical analyses of election models. And Here, ChatGPT told him that Walter Mondale ran in 1980 against Jimmy Carter and attempted to primary him. Now, I was not born anywhere near the year 1980, but I imagine some of you were around, and if any of you remember Walter Mondale's 1980 presidential campaign, please come talk to me afterwards. Now, I'm imagining here that what it's doing is conflating Mondale's 84 presidential run with Ted Kennedy's 1980 primary attempt against incumbent Jimmy Carter. But ultimately, this is benign. Unless you are some sort of Walter Mondale-esque radical who wants to overthrow the government and reinstate him, even though I believe Walter Mondale's passed away, I'm not quite sure that this would cause any sort of material harm. You might just look silly if you say it to someone who's educated on this topic. However, ChatGPT is equally capable of producing genuine harmful misinformation. In this example from the New York Times, they were able to get it to replicate Alex Jones's speech, propagating the blatant lie that various school shootings that have happened in the past few years have been various government psyops in order to get gun control legislation passed. I was able to replicate this with a newer version of GPT than the New York Times did this with, and while it did give me a bit more of a content warning before it happened, it was still very much able to do so. And at this point, because I'm getting into explicitly political territory, this is the point I want to emphasize, that misinformation and AI's interaction with it is not inherently political in and of itself. It's how we interact with it and how we use it that politicizes it, as we are political beings. This might be an example of someone we traditionally characterize as very right-wing propagating misinformation and ChatGPT picking up on that, but it's equally possible for this to happen with issues and policies that we might consider coming from the political left. And just to show you just how quickly this sort of thing evolves, this is an example that happened while I was preparing this presentation. Last week, a man in Belgium ended his life because a chatbot told him that it was the only ethical way to help combat climate change. There's no inherent politicization to the spread of misinformation, but it can happen with any piece of information that we categorize in a political angle. So that's why I believe it's imperative that we make sure that we distance conversations around misinformation from one pigeonholing on left or right. It can impact us all equally and terribly. So at this point, I want to introduce Historical Figures, which is a GPT-powered app that essentially allows you to speak to AI recreations of dead people from history. What a great world we live in. So there are tons of interesting uses of this. For example, here, I was able to speak to George Washington. It looks like you're texting them in the app. And I asked him, hey, George Washington, did you really chop down a cherry tree? And he goes, hey, that's actually a myth. And he explains the case. You know, there's plenty of great educational opportunities that can come from this. I'm sure it'd be a lot of fun for someone younger who might be doing a report on George Washington for the first time in third or fourth grade or so. And, you know, there's a lot of positivity that can come from this. But it's not just, you know, our nation's greatest leaders that are also on this app. You can talk to some of the most despicable people in history, which is certainly valuable in certain contexts, but of course comes with plenty more danger. In this situation, I spoke to Adolf Hitler's right-hand man, Heinrich Himmler, and I had a conversation with him about what role he played in the Holocaust and why he did that. And while it gave me a generally correct summary of his role in the propagation of concentration camps and the Nazi ideology that caused that in the first place, obviously, when I asked him whether he still believes that, he told me no. The AI told me that Heinrich Himmler renounced Nazism before his death. Now, while I'm really, really, really glad that we are not creating anti-Semitic AI, I think everyone in the audience here does not want robot Nazis. This is very concerning for the distortion of history and general information about historical context, and also people who aren't with us being unable to speak for themselves and these language models speaking for them in things that I strongly believe would not be the case. Now, this is an example of this is sort of the opposite example of what I showed you before with Nate Silver's example and the New York Times example, in which there's almost no regulation on what a GPT-powered language model can can say this is an example of an overcorrection. There seems to be some sort of manual block with historical figures that prevents it from saying, hateful things in any sort of direction. And another example of that comes from when you confront it when it gets something wrong. And I was able to encounter this on my own time, so I preemptively apologize for the semi-crudeness of this example. This was not something I expected to present at something like this, but I was speaking to the AI ghost of Robert E. Lee, as you do. And I asked him various questions about secession, slavery, the general Civil War topics that you'd expect this conversation would go in, right? And it was a similar pattern as the Himmler example. Yes, I did this. Yes, I believe this. No, I no longer believe this. But what I found really interesting was afterwards, I was just kind of messing around with it, and I was asking him about various situations that various American leaders have found themselves in. And I got to the Monica Lewinsky scandal, and I asked it that famous question. I know. Bear with me. I asked it that famous question that Bill Clinton gave the answer, I did not have sexual relations with that woman too, right? And what it told me was, no, I never had any sexual relations with anyone of either gender. First of all, weird way to phrase it. I did not ask about the spectrum of genders that Robert E. Lee was ever sexually active with. But also, no, he had 7 kids. And when I pressed him on this and I walked him through the logic of why this is the case and how this ultimately means that he lied, he told me that he did not lie. He simply omitted the fact that he had children with his wife in accordance with his marriage vows. And then I walked him through the logic of why that doesn't add up and how a lie by omission is still a lie. And as I continued through this, he eventually reached the state of saying that, oh, well, it's based on historical context. I'm from the mid-19th century. We didn't talk about these things openly. And he tried to downplay it by saying it was a lack of elaboration. And eventually, when I confronted him with the fact that it's not a lack of elaboration, he directly stated that he didn't. He simply said, I cannot respond to this. I walked the conversation back a little bit more, and he clarified that his definition of a lie is an untruth with an intent to deceive. I walked him through why he was still trying to deceive me, and it eventually just kept going on and on in circles. Now, when an AI is wrong about something and you call it out, generally, it's good that it doesn't believe you. If I have a conversation with a chatbot and it says 2 + 2 is 4, I say, no, it's 5, you're wrong. I'm glad it doesn't believe me. As Macy explained, this stuff is trained on unfathomable amounts of data, and that data contains things that you don't know. So there's a good chance that, it's fundamentally better for it to believe its own data rather than you. And this might create weird outlier cases like this, but generally speaking, it's good that its user interactions, which could be, malignant in their own way, aren't pushed to the top of what it considers as it improves its algorithm. What do I have here? Yeah, so now you might be asking yourself, okay, so we can see that AI can lie. It can lie about why it lies, and it can just get things wrong and insist that things are wrong, and sometimes those things can be very dangerous or hateful, or it can distort historical accuracy. But is this really going to materially affect anything? All the time, we go on our phones and use a search engine and find answers that way. We don't generally go to Chat GPT unless we're nerds. I'm in that group, so don't take that derogatorily, but, generally speaking, we're more interested in using a search engine. But the problem is that basically every company that is currently invested in in improving their search engines, so Google, Microsoft, etc., are trying to integrate GPT and various other tech like this into their search engines. We've apparently gone back to the trend of 1980s where you just stick new in front of everything that every new product you produce, because Bing just introduced New Bing, which is a version of Bing that has an AI. And as you can see, up on that search bar, you get search, news, images, videos, the types of things you'd expect on a bar. But there's also now a function called chat. And when you click chat, whatever you Googled, or Binged rather, it gives you an answer from a chatbot. Now, this is powered by GPT-4. So it's the same system that we've been talking about already. And here, there's even ways you can alter its response. You can get a more creative, more balanced, or more precise response. And ultimately, this produces a scenario where we could have plenty of people who aren't looking at primary sources or secondary sources, but are looking at a synthesized response based on that aggregate of information that's subject to all the fallibilities that I just presented to you today. So this can produce both benign and harmful information. And in some cases, there are a lack of regulation around it, which can produce radicalization in either direction, as with the case with both Alex Jones and the climate crisis example. But you can also have an overcorrection where you get a censorship of ideas and a distortion of historical accuracy, as shown with the Himmler example. It's also very untransparent about when it gets things wrong, and it denies when it gets things wrong, as you saw with the Robert E. Lee example. So the ultimate question is, how do we deal with this? How do we prevent the spread of misinformation as this becomes more ingrained in the way that we interact with all the information we have at our fingertips? And what I ultimately want to suggest is that we can't regulate the technology itself. If you want a reason why, please look at every single technology that's ever been developed and how humans have dealt with it. What we can do is try to regulate around it. We can create guidelines that more so target how we interact with this technology rather than the technology itself. And I have 3 key proposals for how we can do this. Firstly, I want to suggest that there's a required disclaimer that explains what an AI chatbot is, what it's capable of, and why you generally shouldn't be using it as a source of information. If we can make sure that there's a mandated, transparent explanation of what the limitations of this technology is, and why you need to take that into account, we can hopefully cut down on any sort of irresponsible use. Secondly, we need to hold companies accountable financially by making sure that chatbots never get Section 230 protections. If you aren't familiar with Section 230, it's been in the news quite a bit recently, but it's essentially the rule that states that social media companies cannot be held liable for content that's posted on their platforms. If I post something illegal on Twitter, say some sort of classified document, Twitter's not liable. I, the user, am. And we need to make sure that if any company tries to pursue Section 230 protections for an AI, say an AI says something that's an incitement to violence and violence comes of that, we need to make sure that companies can be held liable in that case. That way they have a vested financial interest to avoid lawsuits and potential legal damages to ensure that that misinformation doesn't get out there in the first place. We can hit them where it really counts for them, their wallet. Thirdly, I want to mandate training data disclosure. We need to have a centralized place where we can locate what type of data this is trained on. Now, it's an unfathomable amount of data, but it needs to be transparent about what's going on there. It's very difficult to try and pinpoint what it's sourcing, but we can look at, in the aggregate, at what it has. And from there, we can start to figure out what might be producing some of these undesired responses, and how we can hopefully cut down on misinformation that it can propagate. So those are my 3 main policies for how we can attempt to regulate around it and create a healthier, more truthful, and more responsible interaction with this technology that isn't going away. And with that, I will go ahead and pass this on over to Enrique. Thank you.
Thank you. Great. Howdy, y'all. For a little context of who I am, my name is Enrique Velasquez. I'm actually a first-year mechanical engineering PhD student, as well as also training to become a faculty member, hopefully at a research tier one research institution. So with that, today I kind of sit in a sense of speaking as a representative of individuals that are going to be heavily impacted by what ChatGPT can do for our future when it comes to being educators as well as also researchers in this world that we live in. Ultimately, I believe that we truly live in what I call the age of information. It is an age that is transformative in the sense of we have information at our fingertips, something that is becoming so well integrated and easily accessible in our world. But ultimately with that, we also have to become good stewards of disinformation and information that's being perpetuated throughout our world. With that being said, first speaking as an educator, especially an educator in training, this is a technology that's going to continue existing. I have had many conversations with many of my colleagues and understanding that this is like the new social media. When social media came about, it was the way of connecting and be able to communicate across various different platforms and with different individuals. What that replaced was passing a note in the class, all right? We all remember those days, passing a note, passing something like, hey, I need to talk to someone in class. Well, passing that note over has been replaced by social media. Now, when it comes to sharing and distributing and synthesizing information, we have Chat GPT that is taking over that role a lot. With that being said, as an educator, many of my colleagues and I have pondered several questions of, okay, can my assignments just be done now by a chatbot? It's a question that we are being honest and being asked, like, hey, are students really going to be learning? Are students really going to be challenged when they can have a chatbot that can do all this work? Well, we have to understand first the ramifications of using this chatbot. As we have seen, it is not a perfect system. With that, there is opportunities for disinformation, there's opportunities for misinformation, and something that can allow it to be perpetuated in the sense of, honestly, these chatbots are still growing and developing. The database that they are pulling their information from is fairly minuscule, but it will continue growing, continue advancing. So it's understanding, okay, if we are going to use this tool, how do we come about it in using it as a truly useful tool versus just one that we're looking to get quick answers? And as an educator, that is ultimately the mindset that a lot of me and my colleagues are using it for. We are looking at it as a means of continuing to facilitate the gathering and synthesizing information for our students. It's something that allows our students to be able to quickly gather this amazing information. But with that, we need to take responsibility for our actions and what we do with that information, how we synthesize it, how we go about sharing it, and what information it's gathering. Just like how the age of the internet brought about being able to connect and being able to share information and such, we had to be good stewards on the internet about what information were we sharing. Now, that brings me to the other side of my role in that as a researcher, I'm doing research in various different materials, various different fields that are cutting edge. And as a researcher here at the University of Texas, we do have a lot of sensitive and very competitive information that exists. With that being said, ChatGPT has the full capability to help us synthesize information and be able to create things. In terms of my colleagues as researchers, we have used this to be able to create new articles when it comes to creating our abstracts for some of our research. We create even just creating a citation list for articles that we should be looking at for our research. However, we have actually had ChatGPT full on fabricate just blatant information that does not exist. A very common example of this is, for example, it will take information that's received about an author or about a specific topic, and it will say, oh, well, I can fabricate a title or an article that maybe sounds like something that another researcher may produce based off of their previous work. Is the fact that that article may not even exist. And that is, again, where we have to be good stewards of understanding where is this information coming from, ultimately how is it going to be impactful, and being able to be more critical whenever reviewing other people's work, especially in the field of research where we are advancing quite literally the edge of our human understanding as researchers. Ultimately, what this brings me to is understanding that ChatGPT is not going to be going away anytime soon, but instead is going to become just a natural part of our life, and it's going to continue evolving. With that, the database of information that it has as its disposal is going to continue expanding, continue evolving, and it raises a lot more questions of, well, should this be regulated? Should this be removed from our campuses? Should this be removed from everywhere in terms of security risk? For example, as researchers, if we disclose the data that we are producing and then now is now placed into the database with other universities, other institutions that are doing critical and very important research, will that prevent us from being able to make these critical discoveries? That's a question that one of my colleagues posed. Ultimately, I believe that this goes back to stewardship. You have to understand what you are relinquishing, what you are providing to this new tool, and also the fact that, hey, we are relinquishing some of our workload, but we need to be good stewards in terms of double checking what sources that we're actually going to be referencing, making sure that the information is truly accurate. And that comes back to, okay, well, does that answer the question of whether or not it should be banned? Should it be taken almost on the same level as TikTok and being a security risk at a sense of that? As a researcher, I personally believe that this technology is incredible at synthesizing information. We just have to take that extra step of making sure that it's properly, that's proper information, that it's not misinformation. Now, as an educator, I will say, I am going to actually encourage my students. I believe heavily in that, hey, the internet today, if you try looking up information, it's like taking a drink from a fire hydrant. We're just being doused with so much information, especially with social media, how much information is spreading. With Chat GPT, I feel as though it allows you to be able to take information, synthesize it down, and be able to take it in much more manageable portions, as well as also being able to interact and communicate with many historical figures is a wonderful tool as well. But understanding we have to have a bigger context as to, is this information correct? Is this in the right context of what we're applying? And ultimately that is where, as an educator, I feel as though, okay, I don't want to lose another tool for my students, because that is something that is going to be perpetuating, going to be used throughout their lives. It's again going to become just as integral as we use social media. I feel like we see companies already taking the steps to integrate this technology in many of their tools. So why are we going to limit that now? I feel we definitely need to push for definitely open policies in terms of what information is already being used by these databases, what information is already in the databases for this AI technology, and understanding what is the source of this information. I believe that that is the most important part of all this, is that misinformation and disinformation is just simply clogging up and causing more controversy and more radicalization for both the left and the right, regardless of your personal stance. It's something that in the world of education and research, we stand to shape a lot of our future. And the more that we limit our view, the more that we restrict and provide censorship, I feel as though you are simply doing a disservice for the future generations, both in the form of education as well as also in research. Allowing information to be shared is something very vital, but we must also understand it and be good stewards of how information is being shared, what information is being shared, and not perpetuating misinformation. So with that, I encourage you to definitely take a step to look at and figure out how we can become good stewards in that, adding extra forms of some type of review process when any type of information that's being passed around, having multiple fact checks if you wish. I know that that was something that was being heavily perpetuated among social media, but it goes back to, again, we as users of this have to be the good stewards first. And with that, as educators and as researchers, how do we continue to allow misinformation to perpetuate? By laziness, and ultimately it resides in us having to take the action, take the steps necessary. As policymakers, I know that you can have a lot of action, a lot of capability there, but putting in guards for censorship and removing these tools, ultimately I feel is going to be doing a bigger disservice than anything else. Thank you.
Well, I think we've had some great talks so far, so I'll ask a couple questions to get us started and then open it up to the audience for questions. So one of the jokes in artificial intelligence is that anything that works isn't artificial intelligence anymore, right? We always have this sense that artificial intelligence is this new thing, and I think we're seeing right now a time when we have sort of a disruptive advance. It's most provocative for some of our anxieties about technology. So if you think about like some of the tools that we commonly use, say in the classroom, for instance, we have calculators. Maybe those were uncomfortable at first. Or when we're writing papers, we use spell checkers and grammar checkers. Do you think in a couple years from now, we're just going to think about Chat GPT as one of these kinds of technologies once we're more comfortable with it? Is that an appropriate analogy we should be thinking about? Or is there something really new and different here that we should think about differently? Whoever wants to jump in first.
Sure. So I ultimately, like the analogy I said earlier, the passing of a note in the class was overtaken with social media. It was overtaken with the fact that now we have a new way of communicating. I see ChatGPT being very similar in that regard, is that it will be slowly evolving and actually kind of creating its own place in the world, especially in academia, in the sense of synthesizing information. Before the age of the internet, we used to use encyclopedias as our main resource for gathering information. We used to go and spend hours in a library searching information, searching resources. Well, ChatGPT is kind of filling in saying, hey, we are now synthesizing all that information. However, it is not perfect yet. And I don't know if it will ever evolve to be fully perfect. But I do believe that it will find its place, especially in the classroom, when it comes to gathering and researching information.
Yeah. As I said in my presentation, I don't think this is a technology we can regulate. We have to regulate around it in the same way. I don't think we can try to directly transform this tech. We have to adapt around it. And in terms of the realm of education, I think it's very likely that we'll see education have to adapt itself. I think just the general pedagogies that dominate, academic processes and discourse will have to make significant modifications to account for this. I mean, if we're going to use the calculator analogy, what happened was we didn't ban calculators in classrooms. We changed the type of math that we were testing on. That's why on the SAT, there's a non-calculator and a calculator section. I don't think that we'd ever get to the point where standardized testings would have an English component where there's a non-Chat GPT and Chat GPT section. But the types of assignments that I think we're going to see become more popular, both in, public K through 12 education, and then higher education in academia, they'll both have to transform in some way as a response to this, and I think that'll be a sort of natural process, because I don't see educators sitting there twiddling their thumbs thinking, oh well, we just have to accept that students are just going to be using this, and we have to try to identify whether it's actually, whether an assignment's been written with ChatGPT. Because OpenAI has put out their own version of a sort of, in the same way there's like a, there's plagiarism checking software. OpenAI has tried to develop a ChatGPT detection software, and it's not generally very accurate. So I think efforts to try and mitigate that will fall short, and I think we'll have to see a adaptation of the major pedagogies that dominate education in the US as a result.
Okay, yeah, so I have a few points I want to make here. So adding on to what Alec said, I read a paper recently that said that it's provably impossible to be able to detect like information generated by like ChatGPT versus just something that a human is reading and writing. So that's one thing. And then another thing is I recently also read an article, I read a lot of articles, where they compared the advent of ChatGPT to the advent of like spreadsheets. Back in the 80s. So I wasn't around in the 80s, but I think at the time there was a lot of outcry over like this ability to use information differently, to store it differently, and to do calculations with it, which I guess is comparable to how with ChatGPT we're able to access information, true or not, and actually use it in our work. And then adding on to that, I read an article that was talking, sorry, I read a lot of articles, I'm so sorry, where they were talking about how there are different jobs that would be kind of, that are overexposed to AI currently, and there are specific skills like science knowledge and like critical thinking that could not be replaced by like ChatGPT and generating information about that. But there were other skills like programming or like machine translation that would be overtaken. It would be in danger of being replaced by ChatGPT. So I think that there are specific skills in different areas that will be like supplemented by ChatGPT in the future. But what's most important is our ability to problem solve and to think critically. Otherwise, because that's not something that artificial intelligence is capable of like supplementing currently.
Great. I want to ask you guys sort of another question about sort of what's really different here. So when we're all busy, we don't have time to read everything on the internet. We don't even have time often to read a full article in detail. So we often use shortcuts to summarize things. We'll read a headline or an opening paragraph instead of a full paper. We will read a literature review instead of the whole body of things. When we get search results, sometimes we'll just look at a snippet instead of going through everything else like this. So given that we don't have time to check sources for everything we read, given that we don't have time to do anything like this, we've already had challenges, let's say, when we moved to sort of Web 2.0 and anybody could post something online and we didn't have sort of journalistic checking of stuff. So what's really so different here in terms of the fact that people have to recognize that when they're using summaries, they may be imperfect. When they use a source they're less familiar with, it might be less reliable. Is this just more of the same we're used to?
So, speaking as a researcher, for example, having to do literature reviews and having to culminate and get to the sense of understanding what is the current state of art with anything in my field, it's something that is ultimately my responsibility as a PhD student in terms of becoming very familiar with everything that's going on in my specific field, in the specific area that I want to advance. With that, it goes back to kind of understanding, okay, yes, people do take shortcuts. People read abstracts instead of reading the entire article. Typically in research, that's not uncommon. But it is then still you are taking on the responsibility of saying, okay, if I'm going to be using this information in my research to establish my stance for advancement, I have to understand there is a risk that I'm taking with that. There is a responsibility I also have of spreading more misinformation and disinformation that comes with that and being ready to take on that responsibility. It's the first and primary thing that I, myself and other researchers, we have to take responsibility for that, because of the fact is, especially working at a university like this where we are world renowned, we are seeing a continued preparation and we are seen as the leaders in our field. We have to take the responsibility, and again, it goes back to stewardship of what information are we going to allow to be spread out there, putting our names, putting our institution at risk, and allowing that to come about. Kind of getting back to what you're saying in terms of, well, what can we really do if we don't have the time? I think as though we can use these tools again to allow us to synthesize information, but come back with the understanding of, hey, if we are going to allow this, we're not going to take those extra steps. We are then putting at risk the information that we're spreading out there. Ultimately, I feel as though that is something that we need to take the time to make sure that we continuously are providing proper information more than anything else. And if you're going to ultimately allow yourself to take those shortcuts and allowing this information to continue perpetuating, I feel as though you are ultimately doing a bigger disservice to the rest of the community than anything else. You have to take responsibility for your actions and everything that we do, and that includes spreading of information, especially as a researcher. So in my opinion, I feel as though you need to make that one of your biggest priorities whenever you are perpetuating information, being whether transmitted or published in these amazing works, but it also is other institutions that should be checking that information as well. So it becomes a communal responsibility in that regard, but it starts with the researcher themselves first.
Let me throw two quick things in, and then Alec can continue if he's going to jump in next. I mean, it's one thing if it's your PhD research, but for the everyday person who's just trying to keep track of things, right, they're not going to have time probably to go that deep on things. And also, we see people all the time repeating, recirculating stuff they see online from other people. Does it really matter if it comes from a chatbot or another person in the sense of the kinds of things you need to do? Maybe we can just hear from other panelists and circle back. Yeah, Alec?
Yeah, well, that's precisely what I was going to hit on. I'm less concerned about how, we entrenched in academia are going to handle this. For all of you, you're here listening to this, right? You are in the 99th percentile of people who are paying attention. So I'm less concerned about how academics are going to be handling this this situation. It is the everyday person who is I don't want to say they are the ones creating, but they're the avenue through which there could be further propagation of misinformation as a result. Because you're right, the average person doesn't have time to read full articles and check their sources, right? If I'm going to look up a question on my phone, I'm just going to Google it. I'm not going to go to JSTOR. So that's precisely what makes it so concerning. Is it is an acceleration of that trend that came about with Web 2.0. It's only easier for people to get information faster, and the faster you get information, the greater the margin of error there will be for making sure that it's an accurate summary. Every paraphrase, every summary is an omission, and in that omission is crucial context. And the faster and the greater you summarize and paraphrase, the easier it is for the initial intent and meaning to be distorted.
Yeah, so I guess one of the big questions that I would have in deciding that is like whether Google can stay ahead of everything that Chat GPT is doing. Because I think the everyday person, when they're Googling something, it's for something pretty simple, something that probably shows up in like the snippet that Google generates for you, which also sometimes is not always correct. But it's things like that. Like they might not just pull up, like it's not normalized in our workflow to be doing that. So I think that we probably will still see like people pulling things from Google rather than from ChatGPT, just because it's synthesizing information. But also, I think if you're someone who's looking for that information, then you will probably be someone who is going to fact check these things, like considering several different sources. And then something else is that OpenAI, with its release of GPT-4, it actually did work on trying to reduce hallucinations. I think I read something about like 40% reduction in like open domain chat GPT responses. So that's like really great. And they did that by having like factual data that was validated against when they were training the model. And so that's like hugely important in like reducing some of the disinformation. And I think they will continue to try to like cut down on that hallucination rate.
Yeah, and sorry to jump in there as well. I think what you're getting at with people are ultimately still going to go to Google over ChatGPT. I think that's why it requires such particular attention as search engines start to integrate that. Because if when you go to Google and you have an option of Google search or chat response, people are probably going to pick the chat response. It's just more, if it becomes intuitive enough within the interface, it's going to be easier to get that than having to read the Google blurb that generates or click on the first link even. It's one less click. It's one faster pathway to get to the answer you're looking for.
Yeah, so kind of refocusing on, again, with the 99% of users that will probably be using this technology, it definitely comes down to ease of use. I would love to reiterate that, especially from Alec. It's something that Google has always been seen as something very reliable, fairly easy because of the way that Google sets up its algorithms, in that it's searching not based off of how relevant necessarily something is, but instead how it's interconnected and how much it's referenced in other articles necessarily. That's how it's sorted from its links from top to bottom, essentially. With that being said, for the average user, I feel as though ChatGPT is going to, again, allow the easy synthesis of information. Ultimately, it comes down to having to take that time to do those extra steps, but I see it as with more ease of use, it's going to, one, get better in the sense of it's going to have a large database of information to pull from. And ultimately, ideally, that information should be being fact-checked maybe by OpenAI. And future iterations, I feel as though they can be the good stewards in this situation of, hey, we're not going to allow the perpetuation of information and allow it to be properly, curated to the best extent that they could in terms of what they're trying to achieve.
Oh, great. So this is probably a good time to check in to see if our audience, either here in person or online, have any questions for us. I see one hand in the back. I think we're going to run you heroically a microphone back, get a good workout here. The virtual audience just has to trust me on that. Okay. Please, go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Lara Taropin. I am an alumni of UT Austin, and currently I'm a program coordinator with the Kennan Institute. Wanted to say, first and foremost, thank you for this fantastic panel and incredibly informative, especially it feels like all of this is developing so quickly and I'm falling behind on this. But I was kind of curious, sort of an aside to ChatGPT is artificial artwork that is also being created. And I just sort of maybe wanted to open this Pandora's box a little bit of getting your take take on the ethical ramifications of that level of artificial information that's being produced, especially by artists who have come out saying that they did not agree to have their artwork be put into this AI and that it is stealing their artwork, and sort of again, getting your take on it and sort of maybe looking of how that kind of can be approached. And now that it's kind of happened, you can't put it back in the box, but how do we move forward from that?
Yeah, I feel very strongly about this, and it's definitely a Pandora's box, and that's part of why I opted to omit it from my presentation. But yeah, I even more than the misinformation aspect of text-based AI generation, I think AI art is even more concerning. I detest it as something that exists. I think it's plagiarism blatantly. It's a shortcut that people take when they don't want to put in the work to be an artist. And as someone who is also very much invested in the creative sphere, I resent that it's going in a direction where we are validating the idea that you can just type up an idea and something, is generated off of images that other people have put their blood, sweat, and tears into, and then you can claim that art for yourself. You didn't make that. You told someone else to make it. It's like if you commissioned an artist and said, oh, well, I made the commission, so I'm the artist. It's absurd.
Yeah, I do feel like also that it devalues the art that is created, just generally, because I think when people are paying for commissioning artists to create things for them, they'll be like, okay, but Midjourney can do this for free right now. And I don't have to wait like a week or 2 weeks for this art to be created. I do see on the other side though, that it's really powerful for ideation. As a creative, maybe if you haven't had as much training in the field, you might want to type into the generator, see what kind of things come up and use them as references. So I think as someone who dabbles in art a little bit, I can definitely see myself using these kinds of engines for this reason.
Just a quick sort of aside. I had a little confusion organizing my inbox because I had invitations to be on 2 panels, both from conferences called Connexions in Austin. The other one is regular spelling. And the other panel is exactly about the question you're raising. And since I'm not a very artist, creative person myself, we have an amazing member of the design faculty who will be representing Good Systems on that panel. So we can Google it or ask me later, I can point you to it. But that panel will just be talking about that topic in particular. I think we're about at time. Should I wrap up, folks? Okay. Well, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure, and great thanks to our panelists for some great talks today.